Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking a massive geopolitical shift that's literally unfolding right in front of us. India's bid for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Now, this isn't just about fancy diplomatic titles. It's about the very future structure of global power, and honestly, how our entire world is governed.
To map out this shift, here's a quick look at where we're headed. We'll examine the outdated Security Council, weigh India's powerful case, look at their diplomatic triumphs, analyze the strategic roadblocks, map out their path forward, and end with an inevitable conclusion.
Let's move to our first section and see how this builds. Before we can really evaluate India's position, we've got to understand what this body actually is and how this whole situation started in the first place.
So, the United Nations Security Council, or the UNSC, is the apex global body responsible for maintaining international peace and security. When we're talking about massive global crises, international interventions, or preventing major conflicts, the buck stops here. It is the absolute highest authority in the world for global security. Grasping that scale helps us realize why a seat at the specific table matters so incredibly much.
But, well, here's the massive catch. Back in the 1945 post-World War II reality, the permanent structure was created, handing 5 nations, the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China, their permanent seats. Fast forward to today, that original structure is completely outdated. It's highly unrepresentative and frankly paralyzed by geopolitical vetoes. The world has evolved dramatically since 1945, but this apex body is kind of stuck in a time warp.
Let's move on to Section 2, India's powerful case. You see, India isn't just asking for a favor here. They're presenting a formidable, multi-layered argument for exactly why they absolutely must be included.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this single fraction right here, 1/5. India represents roughly 1/5 of humanity. Think about that for a second. Excluding an entire fifth of the global population from permanent global decision-making doesn't just sideline India. It severely damages the UN's own institutional legitimacy. I mean, how can a body claim to represent global security when it completely ignores such a massive portion of the globe at its highest table?
And the geopolitical portfolio goes way beyond just population size. Yes, India is the world's most populous nation, but they're also the fastest-growing major economy on the planet. Add to that demographic and economic weight the fact that India is a responsible nuclear power. They maintain a completely clean non-proliferation record and have a very credible no-first-use doctrine. These are the undeniable credentials of a major, responsible actor on the global stage.
Beyond economics and military doctrine, there's a tangible historical commitment to global peace. India is historically one of the largest cumulative contributors of troops to UN peacekeeping operations worldwide. And crucially, they have sacrificed the highest number of peacekeepers in the line of duty. This unmatched peacekeeping record shows that India has literally been paying the ultimate price for global security for decades. Their commitment? It's completely proven.
Let's jump into Section 3. Having seen their powerful case on paper, what's actually happening out there on the diplomatic stage right now? Well, look at this recent, highly concrete example. During its G20 presidency, India successfully championed the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member. This specific triumph is absolutely vital because it proves India's ability to act as the voice of the Global South. They aren't just talking about democratizing global governance, they are actively and successfully doing it.
And all of this diplomatic heavy lifting has yielded some serious backing at the highest possible levels. Notice that 4 out of the 5 current permanent members, the US, the UK, France, and Russia, have explicitly and repeatedly backed India's bid for a permanent seat. That's a massive, broad, bilateral endorsement from the world's most established powers.
Which naturally brings us to Section 4, the strategic roadblocks. If 4 out of the 5 permanent members explicitly agree, what exactly is the holdup?
The primary structural obstacle comes from the remaining P5 member. China uses its veto power to systematically block consensus on UNSC expansion, citing the need for a, quote, comprehensive solution. Impartially speaking, this Chinese veto is the most significant procedural roadblock currently preventing India from ascending to that permanent seat. So the crucial point is, the structural hurdles don't actually stop there. Enter the Uniting for Consensus bloc, or the UFC. They're often informally called the Coffee Club, though honestly, it's a lot less friendly than it sounds. This is a bloc of regional rivals actively lobbying against adding any new permanent members to the Security Council at all. So who exactly is in this club? Well, it includes nations like Pakistan, alongside Italy and Mexico. Their underlying geopolitical motivation is pretty clear: prevent their regional peers from gaining asymmetric diplomatic strength. By actively lobbying against any expansion of the permanent members, they keep regional rivals like India from ascending to that high table.
Let's shift gears to Section 5, India's path forward. With these substantial roadblocks firmly in place, what should be done next?
India is taking a clear, multi-pronged approach to tactically work around this gridlock. Step 1, they continue pushing for text-based negotiations within the UN itself. Step 2, simultaneously strengthen many-lateral groupings. And Step 3, continuously expand their global economic and defense footprints.
And this brilliantly illustrates that strategy in action. Just look at these specific minilateral groupings India is actively strengthening right now: the Quad, BRICS, and IBSA. By heavily investing in these alternative alliances, India is effectively building diplomatic power structures outside the traditional UN framework. They're increasing their leverage on the global stage, entirely regardless of the current UNSC gridlock.
Finally, Section 6, an inevitable conclusion. Let's bring all of this together and look at the ultimate trajectory of these complex geopolitical moves.
I want to leave you with this incredibly powerful quote directly from our source material. A UNSC without India is not a reflection of the modern world, it is a historical anachronism. Essentially, it's an outdated relic. If India continues expanding its economic and defense footprints globally, their entry into the permanent high table moves from a mere aspiration to an absolute inevitability that the world simply won't be able to ignore.
Which brings us to our final, provocative thought for this explainer. Can the UN actually remain a legitimate force for global security if its highest table continues to ignore a fifth of humanity? It's a massive geopolitical chess match, and the next few moves will literally define the entire future of global governance. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning and keep learning.
Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to break down India's aggressive and absolutely fascinating transition toward renewable energy. For the world's third largest consumer of energy, the stakes literally couldn't be higher. This isn't just a standard environmental story, it's a profound shift in geopolitical strategy, and today we're going to explore exactly how this massive transformation is unfolding.
Okay, let's map out exactly what we're covering today. First, the green energy imperative. Then, India's global climate stand. Third, driving the transition today. Fourth, bottlenecks and geopolitical risks. And finally, the way forward. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Green Energy Imperative. So, to kick things off, we really need to ask, what exactly is this green transition? I mean, why is it such a massive deal right now? You know, with India's economic growth just accelerating, rapid urbanization, a booming manufacturing sector, their energy demand is poised to explode over the coming decades. Powering all of that growth sustainably, it's not just some nice environmental ideal anymore. It is an absolute, unavoidable economic and strategic imperative.
Think about it historically. Relying on fossil fuel imports has been a huge fiscal threat. We're talking multi-billion-dollar crude oil import bills that leave the country incredibly vulnerable to global shocks in the Middle East or supply chain nightmares. So what's the fix? Green energy sovereignty. By shaking off those external vulnerabilities, India is aiming to build this insulated, fully self-reliant economy. It protects the environment, sure, but honestly, it also secures their own financial future.
Moving right along. Section 2. India's global climate stand.
All right, so how did this all officially kick off? The real catalyst happened on the global stage at the COP26 Climate Summit. That is where India stepped up and unveiled the highly ambitious Pancham-Rit targets. Basically, these targets gave the entire nation its marching orders, pointing them dead straight toward a net zero carbon emission goal. It was a massive statement of intent, and it signaled a complete shift in national priorities. And the sheer scale of this ambition, it's just staggering. A huge chunk of that COP26 commitment involves reaching 500 gigawatts of non-fossil energy capacity. Now, to put 500 gigawatts into perspective, building that out requires an absolutely colossal amount of infrastructure to be developed in record time. We are talking about a total rewiring of how a nation generates and distributes power to over 1 billion people. The exact breakdown of this goal leaves zero room for half measures either. The target is to meet exactly 50% of the nation's total energy requirements exclusively from renewable sources. Think about that. Half of an entire, rapidly growing country's energy demand powered entirely by the sun, wind, and water. They are effectively transforming the very DNA of their energy grid.
Section 3. Driving the Transition Today. Now you might be wondering,
It's super easy to make grand promises at global summits, right? But what is actually happening on the ground now? Let's take a look at the real-world successes, the tangible projects, and the serious capital that is pulling this massive country toward that 50% goal today.
Look at this staggering number, an outlay of 19,700 crore rupees. That is immense financial backing for the National Green Hydrogen Mission. And look, this isn't just about slapping up a few solar panels. This is a highly strategic play to turn India into a global exporter of green hydrogen. The main goal here? Decarbonizing incredibly heavy, power-hungry industries. Stuff like steel manufacturing, cement, and oil refineries. The sectors that are notoriously tough to clean up.
You can really see this momentum building across a few distinct fronts. First off, India deliberately positioned itself as a global leader in solar deployment by co-founding the International Solar Alliance, really pushing for widespread global cooperation. Second, as we just discussed, they're targeting heavy industry through that ambitious green hydrogen mission. And third, they are physically building mega solar parks. Take the Bhatla Solar Park in Rajasthan, for instance, spanning thousands of acres. It is literally one of the largest single-site solar installations on the entire planet.
Which brings us to Section 4, bottlenecks and geopolitical risks. But look, no massive structural shift comes without significant hurdles. The first major bottleneck is weather dependency. I mean, obviously, solar and wind power only work when natural conditions are right, and that triggers our second critical risk, grid intermittency. Without advanced grid-scale battery storage infrastructure, relying on the weather causes severe power grid instabilities and potential blackouts, which leads us to hurdle number 3. To build those giant batteries, you need vast amounts of critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel.
And this is exactly where the geopolitics gets incredibly tricky. Actually, it's fascinating. Fixing one dependency might just accidentally create an entirely new one. The old vulnerability was relying heavily on Middle Eastern crude oil to keep the economy running. The new vulnerability? The supply chains for those vital critical minerals are heavily controlled by China. It's a brand new geopolitical risk, and it has to be navigated very carefully to ensure true national sovereignty isn't compromised while chasing clean energy.
Finally, Section 5, the way forward. So what does this all mean? What actually should be done here? How do you balance the critical need for rapid green expansion while simultaneously mitigating grid instability and dodging these new foreign dependencies? To answer that, we really have to look at deeply strategic domestic investments. The definitive action plan requires investing heavily, and I mean heavily, in domestic battery manufacturing to break those external supply chains. They're using PLI, or production-linked incentive schemes, to financially encourage local manufacturing at a massive scale. Furthermore, to solve the whole grid instability issue, rapidly expanding nuclear energy capacities and developing large-scale pumped hydro storage infrastructure is absolutely crucial. It has to be an all-of-the-above approach to energy storage and production.
Ultimately, it boils down to this. A green India is a secure, self-reliant India. This whole transition is a masterclass in how to combine climate responsibility with fierce national self-reliance, proving that, in the 21st century, energy independence really is the ultimate form of national security. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder today. As global supply chains continue to fracture and shift all around us, will the true superpower of tomorrow simply be the nation that figures out how to power itself entirely from within? Thanks so much for learning with us on this Explainer today.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving straight into this one because today we're looking at a literal geopolitical earthquake happening at the very top of the world. We're going to unpack a massive strategic shift regarding India's northern borders. You know, for decades, the approach up there was actually intentional underdevelopment. Hard to believe, right? But right now, we're witnessing this rapid, high-tech infrastructure expansion that is just completely rewriting the operational playbook in the Himalayas. To really wrap our heads around this transformation, here's our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover the past strategy, the modern pivot, and why roads matter. Then we'll get into the civilian frontline, the massive Himalayan bottlenecks engineers are facing, and finally, future security. Let's get right to it.
All right, starting off with Section 1, Past Strategy and its Historical Policy.
So, to appreciate where things are going, we've got to understand how this all started. Historically, India actually maintained a super conservative policy. They intentionally left their northern borders underdeveloped. And the logic? Well, it was actually pretty fascinating. The idea was to use the incredibly harsh, basically impassable terrain of the Himalayas as a giant natural barrier against invasion. I mean, if there are no roads, an invading army can't exactly roll right in, right? But today, the modern security landscape has totally flipped that calculus on its head.
Modern defense absolutely demands immediate, high-speed troop mobility and logistical permanence. A natural barrier just doesn't cut it anymore. You literally need the ability to move and sustain your forces instantly.
Which brings us to Section 2, the modern pivot and the massive infrastructure boom that goes with it.
This is exactly what's happening on the ground as we speak. We're seeing this aggressive pivot toward building robust roads, tunnels, and strategic airfields as the absolute foundation of modern national defense. And the folks spearheading this? That would be the Border Roads Organization, or the BRO. They are out there delivering some truly iconic strategic projects, like the Adal Tunnel in Rohatang and the highly critical Sila Tunnel over in Arunachal Pradesh. But hey, it's not just about digging through mountains. It's also about owning the airspace. The BRO is responsible for the Neoma Advanced Landing Ground in eastern Ladakh. We're talking about a strategic airfield that can handle heavy military transport aircraft, located right up against the border.
That flows perfectly into Section 3, Why Roads Matter for Operational Readiness.
You might be wondering, why is this specific infrastructure such a big deal? Well, it builds an airtight logistical chain. Step 1, the military gets to use these cutting-edge, all-weather mountain tunnels. This means supply chains to critical zones like Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh stay wide open even through the absolute worst winter snowstorms. Step 2, because these lateral roads are now such high quality, the armed forces can rapidly shift their heavy artillery. We are talking about moving massive M777 howitzers and main battle tanks with ease. And Step 3, they arrive exactly where they need to be at the line of actual control, or LAC, flashpoints. This step-by-step upgrade literally transforms a static defense line into a highly dynamic, fast-deploying force. And honestly, this brings us to a metric that is a total game changer: hours instead of days. Thanks to this brilliant new logistics network, the time it takes to shift troops and heavy armor to potential flashpoints has been completely slashed. Just imagine the tactical advantage here. Being able to respond to a border incident in just a few hours, rather than spending days painfully navigating treacherous, unpaved mountain passes. That kind of speed is absolutely the ultimate currency in border security.
Okay, moving on to Section 4, the civilian frontline and grassroots security. Because it's really not just about tanks and military logistics. To understand India's moves objectively based on our source material, we first have to take a look across the border at a concept known as Shaokang. These are essentially dual-use border villages that China has established along the frontier. On the surface, they serve regular civilian purposes, but they are fundamentally baked right into their broader strategic and border security frameworks.
So, what is India's stand? How do they respond to maintain stability at the grassroots level? Well, on one side, you have China's Shaokang villages, and on the other, you have India's direct counter-initiative, the Vibrant Villages Program. This is a massive national push designed to take remote, often super isolated border hamlets and transform them into well-connected hubs. We're talking bringing in reliable electricity, high-speed digital connectivity, and proper hospitals. It's all about making these remote areas genuinely livable and modern.
The strategic reasoning here is actually brilliant. Providing all these modern resources stops local migration. Think about it. If people have decent hospitals and reliable internet, they don't have to abandon their ancestral mountain homes and move to the cities. And keeping those local populations right there, that ensures they remain the absolute best eyes and ears on the ground for national security. A populated, thriving border is just inherently much more secure than an empty, abandoned one.
Now onto Section 5, Himalayan bottlenecks and geological challenges.
Because pulling off this engineering triumph is anything but easy. The engineers building this stuff are basically fighting a war against geography itself, working at crazy altitudes with barely any oxygen and freezing temperatures. First off, you've got the fragile geology. The Himalayas are young, active mountains. You can't just do heavy blasting without consequences. It frequently triggers terrifying landslides and massive flash floods. And on top of that, you've got extreme weather. These engineering teams are squeezed into impossibly short construction windows, literally sandwiched between massive winter snows that bury the passes and torrential summer monsoons that just wash the roads right away.
So what should be done moving forward? The source material lays it out pretty clearly. The solution is leaning hard into advanced, green, eco-resilient engineering alternatives. You simply can't blast your way through young mountains anymore. These eco-friendly methods have to be combined with crazy fast project execution during those tiny weather windows. That's for sure the only way to mitigate those severe environmental risks while still hitting the strategic goals.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6,
future security and its strategic impact.
So what is the ultimate conclusion of this massive strategic shift? Well, the impact is profound. India's aggressive pivot has essentially leveled the playing field along the line of actual control. By combining these all-weather tunnels, advanced landing grounds, and those thriving civilian villages, it guarantees that frontline troops are no longer left isolated. Instead, they are backed up by what the source perfectly describes as unbreakable steel logistics.
There's a quote from the source material that really hits the nail on the head regarding this whole shift. It states, "The security of a nation begins where its borders are anchored." It makes so much sense, right? An unanchored, underdeveloped border is a huge vulnerability. But an anchored, highly connected border, that is a massive deterrent.
But, all this incredible progress definitely comes with some tension, which leaves us with a fascinating and, honestly, a critical question to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. How can nations balance this absolute necessity for heavy military construction, those unbreakable steel logistics we just talked about, with the urgent need to protect these super fragile mountain ecosystems? It's a literal engineering and geopolitical tightrope, and how they walk that rope is going to determine the entire future of the Himalayan frontier. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this, and I really hope this gave you a clear, structured look at the forces reshaping the top of the world.
Welcome back to another explainer. So, if you've been tracking global defense trends lately, you already know that the space race, it isn't just about exploration anymore. It is absolutely about security. Today, we're going to completely demystify how modern military strategy is rapidly shifting from the dirt on the ground straight up to the stars, and we're focusing specifically on India's defense posture.
Let's just dive right in with this incredibly powerful thought from our sources. Modern warfare has firmly extended beyond the atmosphere. I mean, really think about that for a second. Today's military critically relies on space for, well, almost everything they do down here on Earth. We're talking satellite comms, precision navigation, missile targeting, the whole shebang. If a modern army loses its connection to space, they effectively lose their ability to fight a modern war.
And because of that intense reliance, protecting our orbital assets is now absolutely paramount. Without these orbiting eyes and ears, modern armed forces are effectively stripped of their capabilities. Literally rendered blind and deaf on the battlefield, the skies are no longer just the high ground, They are the ultimate strategic choke point.
Here's our roadmap for unpacking this complex subject today. We'll start with the orbital warfare threat. Go inside India's space agency, look at their current operations and integration, analyze emerging threats and vulnerabilities, and finally, chart out the future of Space Command.
Section 2. Inside India's Space Agency. So how did India officially respond to this intimidating new frontier of defense?
Well, the pivotal year here was 2019. That's when India took this massive leap and officially established the Defense Space Agency, or the DSA. And look, this wasn't just some bureaucratic shuffle. It was a fundamental shift in strategy. Right out of the gate, the DSA was tasked with safeguarding India's space assets and command infrastructure from some really rapidly advancing hostile counterspace capabilities. They essentially realized that defending their borders meant defending their orbit.
Now, the DSA's foundational mandate is something called Space Domain Awareness. And what does that actually mean in plain English? Basically, it acts as the ultimate neighborhood watch for the cosmos. The agency isn't just up there stargazing. They're actively monitoring all space objects, tracking hazardous active debris, and crucially, detecting hostile maneuverable satellites that might try to get a little too close to Indian surveillance constellations. It's a massive, real-time neighborhood watch in orbit.
And all of this crucial data feeds into a massive unified effort called tri-service integration. Basically, the DSA takes the diverse requirements of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force and synthesizes them into one unified command. Why is this such a big deal? Because it ensures these branches share vital intelligence without blowing critical defense funds on redundant tech. It completely prevents fragmented intelligence. Everyone is looking at the exact same picture of the battlefield at the exact same time.
Which brings us to Section 3, Current Operations and Integration. We know how it started, but what are they doing right now?
While the DSA routinely conducts simulated space warfare exercises, they actually call these exercises SpaceX. And no, we are not talking about Elon Musk's company here. This is an internal defense protocol. These exercises are designed specifically to stress test the resilience of India's command networks. They're literally preparing the military for absolute worst-case scenarios up in orbit.
The crucial takeaway here is that they aren't just running computer models in some relaxed office environment. They are actively simulating total satellite blackouts. They need to know exactly what happens if an adversary successfully knocks out their comms. By stress testing this network resilience, they can ensure the command networks on the ground won't just completely collapse during a real hostile engagement. It's all about learning to fight in the dark before the lights actually go out.
Of course, a massive effort like this requires seamless integration with ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization. As you can see, the DSA handles defense coordination, while ISRO steps in as the provider, securing dedicated military satellites. A prime example from our sources is the GSAT-7 series, which is heavily utilized by the Navy and Air Force. And finally, the armed forces act as the end users. They rely on this entire integration to maintain secure, real-time communications across incredibly vast maritime and border zones.
Moving on to Section 4, Emerging Threats and Vulnerabilities. Because securing the skies isn't just about launching satellites and running drills.
To really understand this modern battlefield, we have to look at two very different types of threats. First, you've got the total science fiction reality of kinetic physical attacks. We're talking about adversaries possessing advanced co-orbital robotic arms that can literally grab and physically displace satellites from their designated orbits. Wild, right? But then, on the flip side, you have the invisible, non-kinetic dangers. This is where adversaries use ground-based high-energy lasers to permanently blind satellite optics, or deploy electronic jamming to just completely disrupt communication feeds. It is an incredibly complex and frankly terrifying threat environment.
And that actually brings us to a critical bottleneck. While India is globally recognized for mastering rocketry and launch vehicles, there is a major vulnerability that requires immediate attention, and that is their high-technology import dependency.
The harsh reality is that India still relies heavily on foreign imports for specialized materials, specifically radiation-hardened microchips. Look, normal electronics would just fry in the unshielded radiation of space. These specialized chips are quite literally the only way to keep military satellites alive for years up there. So, relying on other nations for the exact parts that keep your military's eyes open, that is a massive, massive supply chain risk.
All right, Section 5, the future of space command. Recognizing these intense threats and those glaring vulnerabilities we just talked about, what's the next move?
Our sources clearly outline a three-step roadmap to achieve true orbital sovereignty. First up, they absolutely must nurture domestic space tech startups to build those radiation-hardened components in-house and slash that import dependency. Second, they need to develop robust electronic countermeasures to actively defeat the jamming and lasers we mentioned earlier. And third, to actually match escalating global capabilities, the DSA must eventually evolve from an agency into a full-fledged independent space command.
Taking these deliberate steps is absolutely crucial. It'll ensure that India's armed forces never lose their most critical strategic advantage. By taking control of their supply chain and advancing those countermeasures, they retain their vital eyes and ears in the sky, no matter what chaos happens on the ground or up in orbit.
And that brings us to our conclusion for this explainer. As the cosmos aggressively becomes militarized, as robotic arms and high-energy lasers become part of a standard arsenal, it really makes you wonder, will any nation survive the conflicts of tomorrow without an independent, fully-fledged space command today? It's a fascinating, if slightly terrifying, new frontier. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and hey, keep your eyes on the skies.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a fascinating and honestly slightly terrifying paradox. We're looking at how a distant, completely frozen expanse of the world, what is essentially a giant polar ice sheet, is rapidly transforming into a critical driver of both global geopolitics and our overall climate safety. What exactly is this Arctic frontier, and why on Earth should a country thousands of miles away care about it? Well, let's find out.
Okay, let's dive right into this paradox. I mean, how did this all start? For literally all of human history, the Arctic was just an inaccessible expanse of extremely thick ice. You know, it was a barrier, definitely not a destination. But accelerated global warming is fundamentally rewriting the map of our world. As temperatures rise, that incredibly thick ice is melting away, unlocking a region that was entirely out of reach. And this isn't just an ecological event. We are watching a massive geopolitical shift happening real time. So, to make sense of all this, we're going to use a macro to micro approach today. First, a hyper-strategic arena. Second, the resource gold rush. Third, India's Arctic footprint. Fourth, the environmental time bomb. And fifth, a sustainable way forward.
All right, jumping into Section 1, a hyper-strategic arena. Let's start with the big picture to understand what is happening at the top of the world right now and how the geopolitical landscape is shifting beneath our feet, or, well, beneath the melting ice, I should say. Accelerated global warming has transformed the Arctic from just this block of inaccessible ice into a hyper-strategic arena. The rapid melting of those polar ice caps isn't just raising sea levels, it's practically creating a completely new navigable ocean. An area that was literally frozen shut is opening up, creating insanely lucrative new global trade routes and drawing the attention of pretty much every major world power. It has gone from a scientific curiosity to a hyper-strategic arena in just a few short decades.
Moving on to Section 2, the resource gold rush.
So what is happening now to draw all these global powers to the freezing north? The answer actually lies under the ocean floor. The sheer, staggering scale of the economic potential here is driving what is essentially a modern-day gold rush. The Arctic seabed is a massive resource gold mine. It holds an estimated 30% of the entire world's undiscovered natural gas, and on top of that, it holds nearly 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, along with vast reserves of critical rare earth minerals. In a world completely hungry for energy and tech components, the Arctic is basically the ultimate untapped vault.
But you know, the resources are really only half the story. The other half? Logistics. A massive shipping revolution is underway as we speak. Historically, shipping goods from Asia to Europe meant traveling all the way through the Suez Canal and navigating highly congested, politically sensitive global choke points, like the Strait of Malacca. But the melting ice has opened up the Northern Sea Route, or the NSR. This new route completely bypasses those traditional bottlenecks, traveling right over the top of Russia.
And the impact of this new route is absolutely massive. By utilizing the Northern Sea Route, maritime transit time between major hubs in Europe and Asia is cut by up to a staggering 40%. I mean, think about the fuel saved, the time saved, and the completely altered supply chains. A 40% reduction in shipping time is a total game changer for the global economy. No wonder everyone wants a piece of it. Of course, where money and trade go, the military almost always follows. Just looking neutrally at the facts on the ground, we can see rapid militarization from major factions. Both Russia and NATO are aggressively expanding their presence up there. They are constructing deep-water polar ports, building highly specialized military infrastructure, and deploying massive icebreaker fleets. This scramble for control is very quickly turning the Arctic into a potential future conflict zone.
Which brings us to Section 3, India's Arctic footprint.
Now you might be wondering, with all of these superpowers jockeying for position, what exactly is India's stand? Why is a tropical nation, located thousands of miles away from the North Pole, deeply invested in this icy frontier? Well, India has actually been very proactive, unveiling a formal, official Arctic policy. This policy is anchored in three main pillars: scientific research, vital climate monitoring, and economic cooperation. India recognizes that, even though it obviously isn't an Arctic nation geographically, the events happening up north will have massive, direct impacts on its own economy and climate.
And to put this policy into action, India isn't just watching from afar. They actually operate a dedicated permanent research base right up in the Arctic. It's called Himadri, and it's located at Spitsbergen, Svalbard. Having this permanent base gives Indian scientists a vital, on-the-ground foothold in a very rapidly changing environment.
So, the crucial point here is this. What exactly are those scientists at Himadri doing? Actually, it's fascinating. They are studying the direct links between the melting Arctic ice and the variations in the Indian monsoon. As we know, the monsoon is the absolute lifeblood of India's agriculture and economy. If the melting ice at the North Pole is altering the weather patterns that bring rain to Indian farmers, well, then the Arctic is suddenly a very real matter of national food security.
And to ensure its voice is heard on these critical issues, India has engaged heavily on the diplomatic front. They've successfully maintained observer status in the Arctic Council. This is the premier intergovernmental forum for the region, and keeping this status ensures India has a vital seat at the diplomatic table whenever major international decisions about the Arctic are being made.
Now for Section 4, the environmental time bomb.
We've talked about the gold rush and the geopolitics, but why is this so important on a planetary scale? Because the Arctic is, quite literally, an environmental time bomb. To understand the threat, we have to understand the Arctic albedo effect. Basically, imagine the vast sheets of white ice acting like a giant mirror for the Earth, reflecting the sun's heat straight back into space. This is absolutely crucial for keeping our entire planet cool. But as the ice melts, it reveals the dark ocean water underneath, which absorbs the sun's heat instead of reflecting it. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. Less white ice means less reflected sunlight, which means more heat absorbed, which just accelerates global warming even further.
Add to that the extreme ecological fragility of the region itself. As the sources point out, this mad rush for resources brings reckless commercial drilling and heavy cargo shipping. That introduces the massive risk of catastrophic oil spills. And here is the truly scary part. In extreme freezing conditions, underneath thick layers of moving ice, cleaning up a major oil spill is nearly impossible. A spill here would permanently devastate the local ecosystem.
And this environmental time bomb doesn't just stay in the north. As that albedo effect accelerates global warming, global sea levels rise. This directly threatens low-lying coastal cities all across India. Millions of people, massive economic hubs, and critical infrastructure are directly in the crosshairs of the water that is currently melting off the polar ice caps right now. Finally, Section 5, a sustainable way forward.
Knowing the massive economic opportunities on one hand and the absolutely dire environmental risks on the other, what should be done? How do we even navigate this new frontier? Well, according to the analysis of our source material, there is a clear three-step path forward, particularly for nations like India. First, we must deepen our scientific research capabilities to truly understand these huge climatic shifts. Second, as global trade shifts, we have to secure sustainable investments in the Northern Sea Route. And third, and honestly perhaps most importantly, there must be a strong push to advocate for an international governance model, one that strictly prioritizes eco-preservation over the rapid militarization we are currently seeing.
So, what is my conclusion from all of this data? I think this quote perfectly summarizes our explainer today. It reminds us that we have to completely change how we think about the North Pole. It is no longer just some distant, frozen wasteland from a documentary. It is the beating heart of our future global geopolitics and the absolute linchpin of our climate safety. The ice is melting, the cargo ships are already moving, and the geopolitical scramble has well and truly begun. So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. Will the global community actually come together to protect this fragile Arctic ecosystem, or will we simply exploit its demise until there is nothing left but open water and conflict? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Arctic frontier. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly monumental centenary goal, India's ambitious vision for the year 2047, and the specific generation tasked with actually building it. Let's dive right in.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the vision of Viksit Bharat, the demographic engine, youth in action today, navigating the roadblocks, blueprint for the future, and finally, architects of the present.
Section 1. Vision of Viksit Bharat. Defining the goal. What is it really that India is striving for here?
The target is Viksit Bharat 2047. Think of this as the ultimate centenary milestone, marking exactly 100 years since independence. It serves as a hard deadline to elevate India from a developing economy right into a fully developed nation.
Section 2. The demographic engine. India's global advantage. Why is this specific timeline so critical? And what is India's unique edge on the global stage right now?
Imagine an economy driven by this stunning data point. Over 65% of India's population is currently below the age of 35. I mean, that is roughly 2/3 of the entire country. This creates an unparalleled demographic dividend. We're talking about an absolute powerhouse of energy and innovation that literally no other major global economy can match right now.
Section 3. Youth in action today. What is happening now? So how is all this immense, youthful energy actually being applied in the real world today?
We are seeing rapid game-changing shifts across three key strategic spheres. First up, in the startup and innovation economy, youth are actually shifting away from traditional corporate paths to lead high-value breakthroughs in AI, fintech, and space tech. Second, in social and civic transformation, they're using digital connectivity to dismantle archaic barriers and drive grassroots financial literacy. And finally, global representation. Young Indians are projecting soft power globally, from international sports to leading top-tier global tech conglomerates.
To put a hard metric on all that innovation, India currently hosts the world's third-largest startup ecosystem. That is a massive economic engine, and it's powered almost entirely by dynamic entrepreneurs under the age of 40.
But it's not just about business. Youthful intellect is directly resolving complex governance bottlenecks too. Through civic platforms like Digital India Hackathons and the National Youth Parliament Festival, young people are rolling up their sleeves and actively participating in transparent nation building.
Section 4. Navigating the roadblocks. A double-edged sword. We definitely have to be realistic here, because severe challenges threaten to derail this rapid progress.
This brings us to a really crucial crossroads. That demographic dividend of energy and innovation isn't a guarantee. If left unaddressed, it risks flipping entirely into a demographic liability, one characterized by a massive skill mismatch and deep social polarization.
The data points to a dual crisis. First, there's a massive skill mismatch. A huge segment of graduating youth hold formal degrees, but, well, they actually lack the industry-ready technical skills needed for the modern workforce. Degrees just don't automatically equal readiness anymore. Then, you have the digital distraction. Cheap data is great for connectivity, sure, but unregulated exposure to deep fakes and echo chambers threatens to misdirect all that youthful energy into dangerous online radicalization.
Section 5. Blueprint for the future. What should be done? So how do we correct this trajectory and ensure that massive centenary goal is actually met?
The blueprint lays out 3 highly actionable steps to save that 2047 vision. Step 1, bridge the massive skill gap through targeted, practical vocational training so graduates are genuinely ready for the jobs of tomorrow. Step 2, foster a foundational culture of scientific research to keep driving technological breakthroughs. And Step 3, and perhaps most importantly, nurture ethical leadership traits.
Section 6. Architects of the Present. Conclusion. So what is the ultimate takeaway regarding the youth's role in this national journey?
I absolutely love this quote from the source material. The youth are not just the future of India, they are the active architects of its present. It completely shatters the cliché, doesn't it? The youth aren't just waiting in the wings for 2047 to arrive. They are literally building the foundation today. And that brings us to the end of this explainer. I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. Will this generation resolve to lead with character to make India's rise truly unstoppable? The blueprint is there. The demographics are perfectly aligned, but ultimately it requires an active choice. That is the deciding factor for India's 2047 vision. Thanks so much for joining me.
Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're unpacking something that honestly might not sound super glamorous right off the bat, but it is literally the absolute backbone of any multi-trillion-dollar economy. We're talking about India's national logistics policy. You see, if you really want to understand what makes or breaks global economic dominance, you've got to look at how stuff moves. Whether it's a tiny smartphone component, a ton of wheat, or just a massive shipping container full of textiles, moving goods efficiently is the ultimate key to wealth. And right now, India is making this massive, incredibly calculated play to fix its economic machine. The sheer scale of this reform is, well, it's truly fascinating.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to start off by looking at the unseen circulatory system of the economy, then break down the core pillars of the reform, and see all this infrastructure synergy in action. After that, we'll examine some practical bottlenecks, and finally chart the ultimate road to growth.
All right, Section 1, the unseen circulatory system. Let's establish what logistics actually is at a macroeconomic level and why it's the fundamental baseline for literally any nation's growth.
Okay, so let's dive right in. I absolutely love this quote from our source material, "Logistics is the unseen circulatory system of any economy." Think about the human body for a second, right? You can have this incredibly strong heart and a sharp brain, but if your arteries are clogged, the whole system eventually shuts down. It's the exact same thing for an economy. If raw materials and finished goods can't circulate efficiently, industries just choke. Growth dies. It really is that fundamental.
To really grasp the urgency here, just look at this stark visual disparity. Historically, India's logistics cost has set incredibly high. We're talking right around 13 to 14% of its GDP. Now, to put that into perspective, compared to the benchmark we see in advanced economies like Germany and the US, they sit comfortably around 7 to 8%. That massive gap? It isn't just a minor inefficiency. It is a massive, heavy tax on literally every single thing produced in the country.
I mean, when you're spending 14% of your GDP just moving things from point A to point B, that high cost acts as a major systemic drag. It means that by the time an Indian product actually reaches the global market, it's already significantly more expensive than a competitor's product coming from a country with better logistics. It severely hurts India's standing on the global export stage, essentially tying one hand behind the economy's back.
So what's happening now to fix this? That brings us to Section 2, Core Pillars of the Reform, which is completely spearheaded by the National Logistics Policy.
The National Logistics Policy, or NLP, is this incredibly aggressive, comprehensive reform. The primary goal is simple but absolutely monumental: slash those logistics costs, optimize supply chain speeds, and just massively boost overall economic efficiency. The ultimate target here is pulling that stubborn double-digit cost all the way down into the single digits, putting India on par with global superpowers. But, how do they actually plan to pull that off? Well, it starts with the first core pillar, ULIP, the Unified Logistics Interface Platform. Imagine you're shipping a container across the country. Historically, you'd have to deal with shipping authorities, aviation, railways, customs, and they're all functioning in these isolated silos with endless paperwork. ULIP totally changes the game by bringing all these different ministries into one single digital window. By integrating this data, you eliminate the tedious paperwork, the redundant approvals, and those massive administrative delays that just frankly bleed money.
And this brilliantly illustrates the second core pillar, multimodal integration. See, the old way of doing things often restricted cargo to a single, sometimes super inefficient transport route, just because switching modes was a logistical nightmare. But the new way seamlessly links highways, inland waterways, and dedicated freight corridors. It ensures that cargo always moves via the most cost-effective medium available at any given stage of its journey. It's a total game changer.
Moving on to Section 3, Infrastructure Synergy in Action. Because high-level policies are great on paper, sure, but we need to see how they actually translate to physical dirt and steel on the ground.
Which brings us perfectly to PM Gati Shakti. This is an overarching digital GIS mapping tool. Essentially, think of it as the ultimate master map that forces various infrastructure ministries to coordinate their planning beforehand. No one is allowed to just build in a vacuum anymore. Everyone gets on the exact same page before a single shovel even hits the dirt.
To show you exactly why this matters, check out this incredibly relatable and honestly slightly absurd real-world example from our source material. Without Gati Shakti, you'd frequently have situations where the highway department would finish this beautiful brand new road, and then literally a month later, the telecom department would come along and dig up that exact same road to lay fiber optic cables. Just a massive waste of time and money, right? With Gati Shakti, that coordinated GIS planning totally prevents those duplicated, wasted efforts. The cables go in when the road is being built. It's basic common sense, but now it's actually enforced by digital integration.
Now notice the massive 2x multiplier here. This represents the real-world impact of the Eastern and Western Dedicated Freight Corridors, or DFCs. By finally separating freight trains from passenger trains, these corridors have successfully doubled the average speed of freight trains. That means incredibly swift cargo movement directly to critical ports, which drastically cuts down transit times.
Of course, no master plan on this scale is without its friction points. So let's jump to Section 4, Bottlenecks and Practical Challenges. Let's play devil's advocate for a minute and look at what's actually standing in the way.
This table breaks down the current hurdles into two very distinct categories, physical and digital. On the physical side, the main bottleneck is fragmented last-mile connectivity. India is building these world-class national highways, but if the local dirt road connecting a remote agricultural hub to that highway is completely congested or unpaved, the whole transit slows down anyway. Then on the digital side, you've got the unorganized sector. We're talking millions of small-scale independent truck operators and warehouse managers who show really high resistance to adopting these new integrated digital tracking platforms. They're just used to doing things their own way.
So what should be done to actually fix this? Well, overcoming this high digital resistance in the unorganized sector isn't going to happen by just passing a law in Parliament. It requires very specific, on-the-ground strategies. It takes sustained grassroots training to really show these operators how to use the tech. And perhaps more importantly, it requires direct financial and operational incentives to make it actually worth their while to get on board.
Finally, let's move to Section 5, the road to growth. Let's bring our focus back to the big picture and look at the massive economic prize waiting right there at the finish line.
So the absolutely crucial point here is the step-by-step chain reaction. This is really the core of why this matters so deeply. Step 1, by executing this policy, you reduce those logistics costs down towards single digits. Step 2, once those costs are actually competitive globally, you dramatically boost your manufacturing competitiveness, which in turn attracts massive foreign direct investment, or FDI. And then Step 3, that sheer influx of efficiency and capital accelerates the country's march to becoming a multi-trillion-dollar economy. Fixing the supply chain literally acts as the ultimate economic game changer.
Which leaves us with this final thought. If this unseen circulatory system is fully unblocked, and those costs actually hit single digits, is India ready to become the world's next manufacturing superpower? The
The infrastructure is being laid right now, the digital networks are coming online, and the ambition is definitely there. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch this all unfold in the coming years. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helped you understand the mechanics behind India's logistics revolution. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.
Welcome back to the explainer. Today we're diving into a massive shift happening on the global stage. We're talking about India's explosive transformation from a highly vulnerable defense importer to a powerhouse global manufacturing hub. So what exactly is driving this shift? How did it all kick off? And honestly, why does it matter so much to the rest of the world? We're going to break the whole thing down today, looking at the policies and the raw data to see exactly how a nation completely rewires its security apparatus. Let's get into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the historical baseline, moving from vulnerable importer to exporter. Then we'll hit the engines of transformation, the massive surge in global exports, and how indigenous platforms are finally taking flight. After that, we'll wrap up with the strategic obstacles that still remain, and how all this guarantees India's strategic autonomy.
All right, part 1. From vulnerable importer to exporter. Let's look at the historical baseline.
Historically, India was locked in as one of the world's largest defense importers. And, being in that position is incredibly risky. Relying on foreign supply means your national security is completely at the mercy of diplomatic shifts and supply chain blockades. I mean, if a supplier suddenly flips their geopolitical stance, your military is essentially grounded. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing the rise of a global manufacturing hub. India is building a robust domestic defense industrial complex that isn't just arming its own forces, but is actively supplying international partners.
So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that this shift wasn't just some economic play to capture market share. No, it was an absolute necessity for survival. Building this domestic capability, it's fundamentally about securing strategic autonomy. You simply can't be a truly independent global power if you can't even build your own defense systems. It's really that simple.
Moving right along to part 2, the engines of transformation. Let's look at the policy and reforms making this happen.
To really understand India's current stand on defense, you've got to look at the sheer force of their recent policies. Under Atmanirbhar Bharat, which literally translates to a self-relying India, the Ministry of Defense rolled out these positive indigenization lists. Now, this isn't just some polite suggestion to buy local. We are talking about targeted government policies mandating strict import embargoes on thousands of military subsystems. By legally slamming the door on these imports, the government literally forced domestic defense public sector undertakings, or PSUs, and private companies to step up, design, and build these things locally. Talk about a trial by fire for the local industry, right?
But look, policy alone won't cut it. You need serious structural reform. The first major step was dismantling the archaic Ordnance Factory Board, which is wild when you think about it, considering this was a centuries-old institution dating all the way back to British rule in the 1700s. Step 2 was corporatizing it, completely reorganizing the board into 7 distinct corporate entities. And the result? A massive boost in manufacturing efficiency, real corporate accountability, and way better product quality. They basically took the rusty foundation of Indian defense production and modernized it to run like a hyper-competitive business.
All right, part 3, a surge in global exports. Let's look at the financial proof.
38,424 crore rupees, that is the jaw-dropping all-time high in defense exports India recorded for the recent financial year. This isn't just a blip on the radar, folks. It's the direct, undeniable result of that Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative really starting to bear massive fruit on the global market.
The momentum we're seeing here is honestly seismic. We are looking at a phenomenal 62% surge over just a single fiscal year. For a sector that's historically been notorious for being slow-moving and weighed down by red tape, growing exports by 62% year over year is absolutely unprecedented. It signals a massive shift in how global procurement is playing out.
And to really put that mind-bending growth into perspective, Indian armaments are now being exported to and actively utilized in over 80 different countries worldwide. 80. For a nation that was historically pigeonholed as just a buyer, establishing a massive footprint like this as a supplier is a total 180-degree reversal of the global dynamic.
Which brings us to part 4, indigenous platforms take flight.
Let's look at some real-world examples and historic milestones. We've got the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile being exported to the Philippines, the Akash air defense missile system heading over to Armenia, and Pinaka multi-barrel rocket launchers securing major international contracts.
We're not talking about basic ammunition and supplies here. These are highly advanced flagship systems. Securing international contracts for complex hardware like this means global buyers now deeply trust the engineering and reliability of Indian tech.
And back at home, the domestic success is just as critical. This whole strategy is anchored by the induction of massive, highly complex platforms right into active frontline service. The homegrown INS Vikrant aircraft carrier and the advanced Tejas light combat aircraft are prime examples. Look, building an aircraft carrier locally is an engineering feat that only a tiny handful of nations on Earth can claim. It absolutely proves that India's domestic industrial complex can tackle incredibly complex, multi-year engineering beasts.
Now, let's keep it objective. Part 5. Bottlenecks and Strategic Obstacles. Time for a reality check.
So the private sector is impressively contributing about 45% of these exports. Pretty good, right? But there is a major bottleneck hiding here. The foundational intellectual property, the actual deep technological design, is still overwhelmingly driven by the government's DRDO laboratories. If this hub is going to scale sustainably into the future, private conglomerates really need to transition from just manufacturing government designs to pouring heavy investments into their own private R&D and deep tech design.
On top of that, critical raw material gaps remain a glaring vulnerability. There's still a really heavy reliance on foreign supply for specialized materials. We're talking specifically about things like aerospace-grade titanium and specialized carbon fiber alloys. Think about it. You can design the absolute best fighter jet in the world, but if you have to import the titanium to actually build it, your supply links is still completely exposed to foreign variables. Closing this raw material gap is absolutely vital for true self-reliance.
Okay. Bringing it all together in Part 6, guaranteeing India's strategic autonomy, the path forward.
So, what should be done? To overcome those material and R&D gaps we just looked at, the path forward requires some very specific, actionable steps. First up, India has to expand its production-linked incentive, or PLI schemes, to encourage much deeper, long-term private investment. Second, they need to build out a far more robust testing infrastructure right within their twin defense corridors. And finally, they just have to maintain and accelerate this current export momentum to make sure critical capital keeps flowing right back into the sector. And that brings us to the core thesis of everything we've unpacked today. Transforming into a global defense manufacturing hub is the ultimate guarantee of India's strategic autonomy. This perfectly hits the nail on the head as to why all of this matters. Economic manufacturing power is fundamentally and inextricably tied to national security. By cementing its position as a highly reliable global security exporter, India is quite literally securing its own independence.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. Will India's rapid defense ascent soon allow it to overtake traditional Western suppliers in the global South? The geopolitical landscape is shifting under our feet right now, and the numbers we looked at today suggest that a brand new major player has permanently entered the chat. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a profound robotic revolution that's literally transforming the global battlefield right under our noses. What we're witnessing isn't just a minor tech upgrade. Actually, scratch that. It's a fundamental rewrite of the rules of engagement. We're looking at the rapid, fascinating, and honestly somewhat terrifying rise of autonomous drone swarms.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, the dawn of the drone swarm. Then, why the swarm wins. Third, the battlefield today. Fourth, India's strategic stand. And finally, the way forward.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Dawn of the Drone Swarm, from Goliath to David. For decades, conventional warfare relied heavily on the Goliaths. Think multi-million-dollar fighter jets and massive, heavily armored tanks. But this robotic revolution, it's completely flipped that paradigm. We're now dealing with the Davids, low-cost, autonomous, networked UAVs. It's a massive shift from risking a $100 million manned machine to finding absolute overwhelming power in a swarm of maybe $500 drones. To really ground our discussion, we've got to understand exactly what a drone swarm actually is. It's not just a bunch of remote-controlled planes flying in the same general direction. No way. It's dozens of these low-cost, autonomous UAVs networked together by artificial intelligence into a single collective mind. That phrase is absolutely key here, collective mind. They communicate, they share data, and they act as one unified organism designed to totally overwhelm advanced defenses through sheer mass. Moving on to Section 2,
Why the Swarm Wins. Tactical Dominance.
The source material points to 3 distinct advantages that make the swarm practically unbeatable against traditional setups. We're talking about overwhelming saturation, distributed intelligence, and minimizing human casualties. Let's break these down to really get into the mechanics of why the swarm wins.
Picture a radar screen for a second. Traditional air defense radars are meticulously calibrated to track large, fast-moving targets, right? Like a fighter jet or a cruise missile. Now imagine a simultaneous swarm of 50 microdrones suddenly appearing on that network. The radar goes crazy. The sheer volume creates overwhelming saturation. It effectively bleeds out the enemy's ammunition reserves as they try to shoot down dozens of dirt-cheap drones with incredibly expensive interceptor missiles.
But okay, what happens when the enemy does manage to fight back? Say an adversary successfully targets and shoots down 5 drones out of a 40-drone formation. In a traditional human-led squadron, taking 12% casualties instantly? That would cause panic, require intense radio communication, and totally new strategies from human commanders.
But the swarm, it doesn't panic. Thanks to that distributed intelligence we just mentioned, the remaining 35 drones instantly and automatically reconfigure their network positions. Real-time, zero human intervention. They just adjust their flight paths to compensate for the lost units and proceed to complete their kamikaze or reconnaissance strike. The mission just continues flawlessly.
Which brings us to the human element. Because these swarms are so adaptable and, frankly, expendable, militaries can use them to execute really high-risk operations. Like SEED, the suppression of enemy air defenses. They can send this collective mind into the absolute most dangerous engagement zones to draw fire and destroy targets, all while keeping manned aircraft and human pilots entirely out of harm's way. That is a real game-changer.
Let's look at Section 3, the battlefield today, real-world evidence.
We really have to ask ourselves, how exactly are these accessible, low-cost weapons altering warfare as we speak? Because, trust me, it's not just on the drawing board anymore.
This tech is a massive double-edged sword. Looking at current realities on one side, you have low-cost, loitering munitions and FPV drones actively destroying multi-million-dollar tanks globally. But on the other side, we have incredible asymmetric threats. Because this tech is so cheap and accessible, rogue organizations are literally weaponizing commercial off-the-shelf drones. Strapping small explosives to something you can buy at an electronics store suddenly creates a massive threat to VIP security and vital civilian installations.
Now, as dominant as they seem, they aren't totally invincible. The swarm does have an Achilles heel, and that's electronic warfare exposure. Since these swarms rely so heavily on secure inter-drone comms and GPS to maintain that collective mind, they're susceptible to high-powered military jammers. If you disrupt those frequencies, the swarm loses its cohesion. It stops being a unified organism and basically reverts to a bunch of blind, isolated robots.
Which brings us to Section 4, India's strategic stand. Autonomous induction.
When we look at global powers adapting to this huge shift, what exactly is India's stand when it comes to actively developing and deploying this level of autonomous tech?
Well, the data shows a very proactive approach. The Indian Army hasn't just been researching this, they've successfully inducted indigenous drone swarms into their ranks. And we're not talking about basic remote-controlled units here. These systems are capable of executing autonomous target recognition and precision strikes. They're using that advanced, domestically developed AI to make decisions on the fly.
And this is an active, real-world deployment. These indigenous swarm technologies are already deployed right now along India's high-altitude northern borders. It's a crystal-clear demonstration of using cutting-edge, networked tech as a highly advanced deterrent in some of the absolute toughest geographical terrains on Earth.
Finally, Section 5, the way forward, security imperatives.
So what should be done? To counter vulnerabilities like electronic jamming and maintain a tactical edge, the source outlines a clear 3-step security imperative. First up, aggressively back domestic defense startups to drive innovation. Second, developers absolutely need to focus on building advanced algorithms that can resist electronic jamming to protect those comms. And third, military forces must simultaneously deploy robust counter-drone systems, specifically kinetic and laser systems, to defend against incoming enemy swarms.
What is my conclusion from all of this? I think it's summed up perfectly by this powerful quote from our source material. Staying ahead of this technological curve is non-negotiable for modern national security. The paradigm has completely shifted. The era of the Goliath is sharing the stage with the era of the networked Davids,
and adapting to this reality is just an absolute necessity.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, kind of provocative thought. We've seen how the AI collective mind works without human intervention when it's under fire. As these systems grow even smarter and even faster, will human decision-making eventually be removed from the tactical battlefield entirely? It's a profound question about the future of warfare, definitely something to chew on long after we finish here today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the tech that shapes our world.
Welcome to the Explainer. I'm really excited to dive into this with you today because we are tackling what is arguably the most monumental, high-stakes dilemma of our lifetime, balancing economic development with environmental conservation. It sounds pretty straightforward, right? But the reality of managing rapid industrial growth without irreversibly damaging our planet is just incredibly complex. Every single nation on Earth is wrestling with this right now, trying to figure out how to build the future without tearing down the foundation of our natural world. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how this tug-of-war works, using some fantastic source material to map out the sheer scale of the challenge, and more importantly, the solutions.
Look, to really grasp this dilemma, we have to start with a harsh, undeniable reality from our sources. It notes, to lift millions out of poverty and build vital infrastructure, a developing nation like India requires rapid industrial expansion. We absolutely cannot ignore the human element here. When we talk about economic development, we aren't just talking about corporate profits. We're talking about basic survival. We're talking about raising the standard of living and providing vital necessities like roads, hospitals, and power grids to millions of people. For a developing nation, industrial expansion is not just some option on the table, it's an absolute necessity.
But, that necessity immediately brings us face to face with the massive question driving today's explainer. Can we actually grow without destroying? Because here's the trap. If we just pursue unchecked, wild growth, we trigger what experts call an unsustainable loop. We build rapidly, we degrade the environment, and in turn, that degraded environment triggers catastrophic climate feedbacks that literally destroy the very infrastructure and communities we just built. It's a vicious cycle, and we have to figure out how to break it. Okay, let's just jump right in. Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, the core growth dilemma. Second, economy versus ecology today. Third, India's sustainable policy stand. Fourth, greenwashing and policy gaps. And finally, number 5, the path forward. All right, part 1, the core growth dilemma. What actually is it and how did it start? So the whole issue really comes down to defining what true national progress actually looks like. The gold standard here is sustainable development. Basically, this means meeting our current economic needs, getting those millions out of poverty right now without compromising the safety and resources of future generations. It sounds perfectly balanced in theory, doesn't it? But actually implementing this bedrock concept on a massive national scale, that is exactly where the friction begins. Which brings us to part 2, economy versus ecology today. What's happening on the ground right now, and why does it matter? Think about the sheer scale of the infrastructure being built today. We have an immense push for strategic projects, border highways winding through vast mountains, and massive hydro projects designed to generate power. It's incredible, absolutely necessary engineering. But, and this is a huge but, when we construct these massive projects in ecologically fragile zones like the Himalayas, unguided by strict environmental guardrails, nature pushes back, hard. We see devastating landslides, cloudburst impacts, and massive structural damage. The Earth literally gives way under the weight of unguided ambition. And it's not just mountains. There's a hidden economic cost to our massive industrial output, too. Sure, running conventional coal-powered plants and heavy manufacturing makes our GDP look fantastic, but the trade-off is severely degraded air and water quality. And here is why this matters from a purely economic standpoint. That pollution results in massive long-term public healthcare expenditures. We essentially end up paying for that cheap industrial output with the health of the population and an unbelievable strain on our medical systems. So, let's move to part 3, India's sustainable policy stand. What exactly is India doing about all of this? Well, the good news is proactive steps are being taken, and they're actually quite sophisticated. Let's break down 3 major policy levers our sources highlight. First up, we have green bonds. The government is floating these specialized bonds to raise capital exclusively for eco-friendly infrastructure. It's putting the money right where it needs to be. Second, PLI incentives, or production-linked incentives. This is a massive backing of the electric vehicle and battery ecosystems, basically incentivizing the entire market to shift away from fossil fuels. And third, the CAMPA mandates. This is a strict legal requirement where any industrial clearance that removes forest must be balanced by continuous verified afforestation projects somewhere else. Basically, if you cut down a tree for industry, you must plant and verify new ones.
But of course, it's never perfectly smooth. Part 4, greenwashing and policy gaps. Let's talk about the reality of implementation.
One of the absolute biggest hurdles we face right now is greenwashing. You've probably heard the term. It happens when corporate entities exploit legal or regulatory loopholes. They take completely standard polluting commercial operations and package them as eco-friendly, just by using clever superficial branding. They get the positive PR boost without actually implementing any real zero-emission changes. It creates this total illusion of progress that actively harms our ability to reach true sustainability. And this implementation gap is deeply, deeply felt at the grassroots level. Our sources point out that environmental impact assessments, or EIAs, the very studies meant to protect the land in the first place, are sometimes rushed or completely compromised. When enforcement gets lax, heavy real estate and mining operations just bulldoze straight into critical eco-sensitive zones. And what's the direct result? Exactly what we talked about earlier: severe structural failures, landslides, and collapsed infrastructure. The laws exist, but the grassroots enforcement simply has to be tighter.
All right, finally, part 5, the path forward. What should be done and what is the conclusion?
The sources actually lay out 3 highly actionable solutions to fix this unsustainable loop. Step 1. We absolutely must strictly enforce green construction codes. No more compromised assessments. We have to build with nature, not against it. Step 2. We need to transition toward a circular economy. This means prioritizing recycling at a massive industrial scale so we can stop extracting raw materials at such a destructive rate. And step 3, harness localized green energy networks. By decentralizing power and relying on local renewable sources, communities become far more resilient, and we slash our reliance on those massive coal plants. So when you synthesize all this information, a really powerful thesis emerges. Economy and ecology, they aren't actually opposing forces. They are 2 sides of the exact same coin. By ensuring that our development is genuinely sustainable, by enforcing the rules and embracing green technology, we can build a nation that is both economically invincible and ecologically pristine. We really do not have to choose one over the other. In fact, we literally cannot have long-term success in one without the other.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. If our economy and ecology truly are 2 sides of the very same coin, which side are we investing in today for tomorrow's survival? Because the infrastructure we build right now, the policies we enforce right now, and the greenwashing we tolerate right now, that is exactly what will determine the world we inherit tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you next time.